Hello everybody, Carl Larson here with a quick tip tutorial for you. Lately I've been shooting time lapses on my digital SLR instead of my video camera. This way I have extra resolution, a broader color space, more flexibility in post, and I can use whatever lens I want. But recently I ran into a workflow issue that made me scratch my head a little bit, so let me show you my problem and how to get around it. In the past, I'd viewed my options for processing images in After Effects as one of two scenarios. First, I could shoot RAW and then have the ability in Adobe RAW Converter to recover highlights, play with vibrance, clarity, and a bunch of other features that aren't yet directly implemented into Adobe After Effects toolset. And it's a pretty great way to work if you're willing to wait a little bit longer on your renders for a really high quality result. The other option is to shoot in JPEG and then handle all of the color correction directly in After Effects, just like you would with any other standard video footage. But there's a third option that was giving me trouble. In CS3, Adobe introduced the ability to open JPEGs and TIFFs in the Adobe RAW Converter. And even though you can't push the TIFFs or JPEGs quite as hard in the RAW interface as you would with an actual RAW file, it's been a really great addition to the Creative Suite to have as an option. Personally, I think it's a great way to recover highlights and add some fill light to a scene in an efficient, yet visually pleasing manner. But here's my problem. When I import a JPEG image sequence into After Effects, even if I've already set my RAW conversion develop settings in Bridge or Lightroom, they don't come through into After Effects by default. So let me flip over into Adobe Bridge and show you what I mean. Here's a JPEG image sequence I recently shot in Colorado. As you can tell, the image is pretty flat, and I might have clipped out some of the information in my highlights. The first thing we need to do is make sure that the camera RAW preferences are set so that we can edit JPEG and TIFF files in Adobe Camera Raw. So go to Camera Raw Preferences and make sure JPEG and TIFF handling are enabled. Here you can choose two settings for how the images are handled. Automatically open JPEGs with settings. This will open your images directly in Photoshop or After Effects just like normal unless you specifically tell it to open through the Adobe RAW Converter. I like this option. It leaves everything as normal unless I tell it to operate differently. Alternatively, you can choose Automatically Open All Supported JPEGs. This will force all images to go through the Adobe RAW Converter dialog box every time you open an image. Personally, I think it's a little cumbersome, but you can decide what works best for you. Anyway, now that we've got our preferences set, let's select our first image and click on Open in Camera Raw, or right-click to choose Open in Camera Raw from the contextual menu. So now in Camera Raw, let's see how much information we can recover to make this image really pop. And I'll just kind of blast through the settings here, assuming that you're at least somewhat familiar with them. If you want more information on what every button and switch does, check out Rich Harrington's two-part tutorial series on this topic in the Photoshop for Video podcast. Alright, so I'll first turn down the exposure just a hair. Second, I'll raise the recovery slider until I get more detail back in my clouds. Raising this too high can make things look funny, so use it as you see fit, but try not to crank it too high. Next, I'll add in some fill light, bring down my blacks, push the contrast, clarity, vibrance, and saturation just to give you an idea of how far we can take it. Now I'll re-white balance the image by grabbing the white balance tool in the top of the menu and picking a neutral value from the clouds. Wow, that's a huge difference. There's a whole bunch more tabs in the interface where we can play with curves, sharpness, and even correct for chromatic aberration. But in an effort to keep this a quick tip and not a long tip, let's assume that we're happy with our changes the way they are, click Done, and return to Adobe Bridge. Now we can see our changes have been applied to our first image, and it's got a whole lot more life. Now, switching over to After Effects, I should be able to get my RAW development settings to cross over on import, right? Well, let's give it a shot. So double-clicking anywhere on the project pane, let's navigate to our image sequence, select the first image, make sure we're importing the footage as a JPEG sequence, and click Open. When we do this, you'll notice our images are still as flat as when we started out, so something's going wrong. And here's what this quick tip has been building up to the whole time. How to import a JPEG or TIFF sequence into After Effects with Camera Raw development settings applied. So let's do the same thing, but now with a couple modifications. So just like before, double-click anywhere in the blank space of the project window, navigate to the source images, select the first image, or in this case any image since our last development settings are still in memory, but now change the Enable pull-down from All Acceptable Files to All Files. Next, change the format from JPEG to Camera Raw. Even though we're importing JPEGs, we want After Effects to read the images as though they're RAW files and apply the development settings that we've come up with. Make sure Camera Raw sequence is checked, and click Open. This will launch the Adobe Camera Raw development settings interface that we've seen before. Since we've already tweaked our settings, click OK, and now we've successfully imported our images with the development settings applied. Now let's drag both sequences into a composition so we can compare the two side by side. Man, that looks a whole lot better. And now that we've got the sequence imported with the raw settings, we're still free to manipulate the content within our comp window just like any other footage. So with a little playing around, we can get some really pleasing results. Like this. Also, something to note about this workflow is that you can always go back at any time and change your development settings. Simply highlight the footage and go to Edit, Edit Original to re-invoke the Adobe Camera Raw dialog box to change whatever settings you'd like. And keep in mind, this technique doesn't have to apply to time-lapse work only. You could apply the same idea to stop-motion photography, 3D renders, or even as a way to salvage some really poorly exposed video. I mean, hey, you're the artist, and hopefully this just gives you one more crayon in the box to play with, even if it is a little slow to render. So until next time, I'm Carl Larson for CreativeCow.net. Oh, and by the way, if you have a quick tip that you're just dying to share with the world, shoot us an email at aetips@creativecow.net. And if your tip is selected, we'll make sure you get the credit if we turn it into a quick tip tutorial. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you around.